Good afternoon, guys. Mr. Monk here. Just kind of film a quick video for you to talk about Section 2, Chapter 13, Economic and Cultural Revival during the Medieval Times. We are going to work through the section kind of just like we do in class. We're going to talk about some of the high points of the section, talk about some of the notes that you need to be aware of, and try to give you a little bit of chance just to have some lecture to listen to go along with your discussion and go along with any other assignments that I'll assign you for this chapter. Fairly long section, but I'm not going to try to take too long here. Just make sure you watch all the way through the video so it does make sense to you. If you have any questions, make sure to send me, write those questions. And if you need anything else, just make sure to let me know about that. Alright, so let's get started. Alright, so of course, Section 1, I gave you the assignment here a while back to read on the Crusades. Very, very important event, or a series of events that occurred in Europe throughout the early 11th century. But over in Section 2, we're going to talk really and focus on this economic and cultural revival that's going to happen following the Crusades in Europe. And during this time period, you're going to see a revival of economy, of trade, of religious thinking, of learning in general, and it's really going to lead to the rise of more modern Western Europe as we think of it today, and then kind of its effects on the development of the United States. Right, so like I said, the Crusades are going to accelerate the transformation of Western Europe from a society that was crude, backward, and violent, showing little cultural and technological advancement, to a civilization, right, that's going to be advanced, and it's going to show the early features of Western civilization, right? So towns are going to grow. That's one thing that's going to happen during this time period. Trade is going to expand between different groups of people, and the learning and the arts are going to thrive. All right, so we're starting on page 322 if you want to follow along. We'll just go from there. Right, so economic expansion. The economy of Western Europe, right, is going to begin to show vigor, or kind of like excitement, growth, movement in and around AD 1000. Agricultural production is going to increase during this time period. Expanding opportunities in trade are going to encourage the growth of towns, and the lively atmosphere of those towns that are growing because of that trade is going to inspire and stimulate creative thought and innovations in art. So let's talk about first some of the agricultural advances that are really going to lead to expanding opportunities in trade. So plows during the early Middle Ages, right? Plows I'm talking about, right? You know, kind of your stereotypical plow that you pull on a horse or an oxen to plow the ground, right, to prepare it for planting. Plows during the early Middle Ages were very light. They did not weigh a lot, and they didn't cut much below the surface of the soil. Okay, so during this time period, what you're going to have is the invention of a new, much heavier plow that is going to make it possible to cut through the very rich, damp soils of northwestern Europe. All right, so the plow is going to enable farmers to produce more and to cultivate new lands, increasing food production. So essentially what these plows are going to allow farmers to do are move into areas and plant and grow things in areas that haven't been used before, ever in world history, kind of up to that point. So, right, so nobles and freeholders. All right, so people kind of all the way from the top down socially are going to clear forests, they're going to drain swamps, and they're going to build villages in these new areas that they can access because of some of this new technology. And really in one of the largest migrations of Europe, really in the world of that time. All right, so about the same time, the collar harness is going to replace the ox yoke. Okay, and this is going to be essentially a mechanism that is going to disperse the weight, okay, of the plow or whatever animal is pulling from the neck, okay, down to the shoulders. Which allows the animal to carry more weight or carry it faster. But what people in Europe are going to do, or they're going to start using horses, okay, to pull the plow instead of oxen. And horses are a lot faster at pulling the plow than oxen are. So What that's going to do is it's going to allow farmers, okay, to plant and plow more crops more quickly, okay, leading to more food production. Right? So as the land began to feed more people, naturally, okay, the population of Western Europe is going to increase. All right, so moving over to page 323, let's talk about the expansion of trade in areas such as banking. So the revival of towns is going to cause a rapid expansion of trade, right? Because towns are waking up, they're coming alive, and trade is kind of coming alive too, right? People are looking for ways to make money, make a living, and of course, one of the age-old human inventions of making money, right? Trading things, right? Trading one thing for another, a service for another service, or a service for a monetary amount, whatever it may be. Right? So soon the sea lanes and the roads were filled with traders carrying goods to market. Right? Important sea and river routes connected Western Europe with the Mediterranean, Eastern Europe, and Scandinavia. Of course, the repaired Roman road, right, that was built during the Roman Empire is going to be kind of fixed up and used once again. This is going to allow international traders to come in and out of Europe. All right, and then you've got Italian towns, right, such as places you've probably heard of before, like Venice, right? They're going to control the Mediterranean trade after AD 1200, bringing silks and spices from Asia to Europe, right? And then you got Flanders, right, a region including present-day northern France and southwestern Belgium. It's going to become the center of trade on Europe's northern coast, right? So essentially in these towns, what you're going to have is these areas really that become these trade centers. And of course, all the things that you could find, or the merchandise you could find in these towns, is going to be varied from place to place. But you're going to have a greater variation of goods that are for sale in these places because of this revitalization of towns and of trade alike. All right, so let's talk about banking in this time period. So some of you probably never thought of, like, where did banks come from? When did they start? All right, banking and the industry of banking began all the way back, really in the late 11th century, early 12th century. And there's a need why the banking industry kind of came about. All right, so early merchants used the barter system, right? So when trade starts increasing, people start trading stuff, right? So what system did they use, right? Well, they used the barter system, right? They would trade goods without money. So they might trade corn for potatoes, or they might trade, right, silk for sugar. All right, they traded items between themselves and other people. All right, before long, however, merchants are going to find this system impractical. Right. Moreover, some of the merchants who supplied luxury goods during the time period, right, the goods everybody wanted, like silk, they would only accept money in payment. They didn't want goods, right, because they were luxury items, and they were trying to accumulate wealth. Well, particularly money, not sugar, flour, or spices, things like that. So, European merchants came to the point where they needed a common medium of exchange. They needed some type of currency, right, to pay for things and to trade for things. All right, so this is going to lead to the rise of a money economy. And you need to look this term up. You need to know what it means. Okay, but essentially what a money economy means is an economy based on money. All right, that should be very easy to remember. But the emergence of this money economy is going to bring about a number of great changes to Europe. Okay, initially it's going to lead to the rise and the growth of banking. All right, so since traders came from many countries, they carried different currencies at different values. If you've ever gone to a foreign country, you've probably had to do this before, right? Before you left, or once you got there, say you went to Mexico, right? Or you went just anywhere, right, that it would be easier to have those people's form of currency, right? Well, before you left the United States, or once you got there, you're going to go and you're going to trade in some of your currency for some of their currency, right, so you can buy things in their country. Well, this is going to be, okay, kind of one of the main functions of people called money changers, okay? And a lot of these money changers were Jews or Italians. And what they would do is they would determine the various values of currencies and exchange one currency for another. All right. They're also going to develop procedures during this time period for transferring funds from one place to another, receiving deposits and arranged loans. All right. These Italians and early Jews are going to really become kind of the first bankers we see in world history. And in Europe, indeed, the word bank, all right, that we get today comes from banca or bench that the money changers set up at fairs. Okay, so very historical connection there. All right, so as the money economy grows, it's going to put the feudal classes in economic squeeze, right? Kings, clergy, and nobles became dependent upon this medium of exchange, this money from banks to pay their expenses, right? Because they had land, they had horses, they had oxen, but they didn't always have money, okay? And since the system was changing and this money economy was developing, even kings and lords and knights needed money, okay? So they're going to depend on these money changers, these bankers, okay, to do just that, all right? So to pay off their loans, they had to raise taxes, sell their lands, or demand money in place of traditional feudal services. And if serfs became able to buy their freedom, the feudal system is going to decline. All right. So what you're going to have is this, really this separation where people move away from having to be dependent upon land or crops for wealth. Okay. They're going to be moving toward, if you possess money, all right, you can be wealthy, not just land. All right. So let's talk about the growth of towns. We got a good bit here, and we'll continue on. So the number of towns in Western Europe is going to grow tremendously in the AD 1000s and AD 1100s. Right? Many grew up beside well-traveled roads or near waterways. That's common sense, right? A lot of people are traveling those avenues all the time, right? So it's kind of natural that a town or a village would, right, spawn up beside those. Towns during this time period kind of developed. Initially, they were very much like open, but trying to protect themselves from outside threats and other such things. A lot of towns are eventually going to build large stone walls, right, and have shops inside, houses, all kind of different things. Right, during this time period, most buildings are going to be made out of wood and thatch roofs, making fire a very much constant threat in small towns and villages. And another problem in medieval towns is that they almost had always no sanitation. All right, and there was a constant stench that assailed the people from the garbage and sewage tossed into the streets. Right, because where were people going to take it? All right. These conditions are going to cause the rapid spread of diseases. In crowded towns, such diseases often turn into epidemics and took many lives. And the worst of these epidemics, the bubonic plague, or the Black Plague as we know it, right, is going to ravage Europe between AD 1348 and 1350, killing 1/3 of the population of Europe. Okay, so really, even though towns are growing, what you do have is some of these unintended problems that are going to develop that later on are going to push for reforms and push for innovations in technology to help with some of those issues. All right, so let's talk about guilds. Maybe a word you've heard of before, maybe not. But during the AD 1100s, merchants and artisans are going to organize themselves into business associations called guilds. And kind of the best way I know to explain this is a guild is going to be kind of very specific to the occupation, right? Whether you're a merchant or an artisan or a banker or whatever it may be. And these guilds are going to kind of be like business associations where numerous, bankers or numerous artisans or numerous merchants would join together in this association and essentially work together, use their bargaining powers and other abilities they had, to essentially make sure that the situation, or the business that they were in, would always favor its members, meaning instead of being all separate, right, and just trying to compete against one another and it kind of being a dog-eat-dog world, what they would do is they would band together, work together, okay, to protect the businesses and the people within the guild, okay, for the betterment of all the people in the guild. All right, so the primary function, for example, of the merchant guild was to maintain a monopoly of the local market, right? So, right, the local merchants in the guild would get the business, all right? So to accomplish this end, merchant guilds severely restricted trading by foreigners in their city and enforced uniform pricing, right? So you're making sure that outsiders can't come in and sell, and then you make sure, right, uniform pricing, kind of everybody sells the same product around the same price, right, to make sure no one gets all the business, that kind of thing. All right, so craft guilds, by contrast, regulated the works of artisans. So carpenters, shoemakers, blacksmiths, masons, tailors, and weavers, that's kind of the artisans that were in that group. Right, so craft guilds would establish strict rules concerning prices, wages, and employment. Right, so for instance, a member of the shoemakers guild could not charge more or less for a pair of shoes than other shoemakers, nor could he advertise or any way induce people to buy his wares. Okay, so what it did is it prohibited competition, okay, and it tried to set standards of quality that protect the public from crappy goods is what it did, okay. So craft guilds were controlled by masters, all right, you need to make sure you know that, or artisans who own their own shops, okay, but there was a process of becoming a master where you could own your own shop, but until that point, you could not just go open a business and own a shop of your own, okay. So essentially how the process worked, an artisan would serve as an apprentice, okay. That means they worked for no pay, and once they became a journeyman, they could receive pay. However, they had to work under that specific master, okay. And at some point, to become a master, a journeyman had to submit a special sample of his work, okay, whatever industry he was in, and that masterpiece would be sent to the guild for approval. Okay, if the guild approved the sample, the journeyman could become a master and then could set up his own shop, right, and work towards gaining profits and own his own business. Okay, so now let's talk about one of the most important things of this section, the rise of the middle class. All right, so the medieval town or burg created the name for a new class of people. In Germany, they were called the burghers. All right, in France, the bourgeois, and in England, the burgesses. Okay, the name originally referred to anyone living in a town. Gradually, though, it was going to come to mean the people who made money through the developing money economy. Okay, they were a middle class made up of merchants, bankers, and artisans who no longer had to rely on the land to make a living. So these, I'm going to refer to them just as bourgeois, all right, or middle class. They are going to make their living and all the services really associated with the money economy, right? Banking, selling, and trading, and artisans, those that provided services. And even today, we kind of still refer to the middle class as very much those individuals, right, that have a hand in producing or manufacturing and providing services, okay? These people weren't connected to the land in particular to make their living, right? They didn't have to own land to make their living or to make money, but they found a place within the money economy that they could use to their advantage. All right, so the middle class is going to help turn towns into organized municipalities. Businessmen are going to create councils to administer town affairs and gain political power for themselves. Right, and as the money economy is going to spread, kings are going to begin to depend on the middle class for loans and for income from the taxes they pay. The leading merchants and bankers became advisors to lords and kings. So what you see happen is that this middle class is going to rise in significance and importance, and they're really going to become a very much respected class and very much needed class during this time period, and it's really going to have a huge impact in world history. All right, so let's talk about town governments. So what did the town government look like during this time period? Of course, conflict is going to gradually develop between the feudal classes and the bourgeois. So city dwellers did not fit into the feudal system, right? The middle class really didn't fit in. They resented only owing taxes and services to lords, right? They weren't peasants. They didn't consider themselves peasants, and they didn't really agree with having to pay taxes to the lords. They wanted to run their own affairs, and they wanted to have their own courts and laws. All right, and at the same time, right, the feudal lords enjoying hundreds of years of power, right, didn't want to really let that power go, and they feared the growing wealth and power of the middle class, right? So to try to keep these bourgeois in line, what the feudal lords are going to begin to do is try to strictly enforce feudal laws, right? But the money economy is going to give the towns a level of income and power they needed to win the struggle against the lords. In the 81,000 Italian towns are going to form groups called communes, and the growing money economy are using, okay, the political power they gain from the growing money economy. The communes are going to end the power of the feudal lords, and they're going to make the Italian towns into independent city-states. All right, in other areas of Europe, kings and nobles are going to grant townspeople charters, okay, which is essentially going to give the local people permission or authority to run their own affairs, separate from the authority of the lords. Okay, so you see a little bit more local control start to develop, right, with the rise of the middle class. And this idea that local people should control local affairs, all right? Very important development in government and the idea of government. So let's talk about education, which is going to be another little major part of this section discussion. And then we're going to talk about some art and literature, and we're going to be done. All right? So during the Middle Ages, most people were illiterate. That was just a simple fact. Education was controlled by the clergy, and most of the time, if you got a chance to go to school or were picked to get an education, it was for the purpose of preparing to be clergy or officials in the church, right? But as towns grew, the need for educated officials stimulated a new interest in learning. The growth of courts and other legal institutions is going to create a need for lawyers, and as a result, around AD 1150, okay, students and teachers are going to begin meeting away, okay, from monastery and cathedral schools, and they're going to form organizations known as universities, okay, and this is going to be where the idea kind of your modern day university, like Mississippi State, Ole Miss, any college, right, is going to develop. So let's talk some about those universities. At first, the university was not so much a place, right, like we envisioned somewhere like Mississippi State, as it was a guild of scholars organized for learning. Classes were held in rented rooms, churches, or outdoors because books were very scarce. A teacher would read the text and discuss it, just much kind of like the same thing we do right now, while students would take notes on slates. Right? Classes did meet regularly, and universities did set rules down for the obligations of students and teachers towards each other. Sounds very familiar. And to qualify as a teacher, students had to pass an examination leading to a degree or certificate of completion. So a lot of the same things that we associate today with our modern day university, right, are present here. And by the end of the AD 1200s, universities are going to be spread throughout Europe. Most southern European universities are going to be they're going to specialize in law and medicine. And then in northern Europe, what you're going to have, your universities are going to specialize in things such as like liberal arts and theology. Okay. All right, so let's talk about new learning. So medieval scholars are going to study Roman law, the works of Aristotle, and Muslim writings. However, many of the church leaders during this time period were kind of wary of people studying Aristotle's works because they feared that his ideas might threaten Christian teachings. In contrast, some scholars, though, thought that the new knowledge that they could learn from people like Aristotle and other writings could be combined with Christian ideas, or for instance, those ideas could support Christian ideas. So they're going to apply Aristotle's philosophy to theological questions, and they're going to develop a system called scholasticism. This new type of learning is going to emphasize reason as well as faith in the interpretation of Christian doctrine. So essentially what scholastics is going to do, it's going to seek to reconcile classical philosophy with the church's teachings. They believe that all knowledge could be integrated into a coherent whole. So what they essentially thought is that you could take knowledge that wasn't necessarily from the church and use it to support church theology or church teachings. So in the AD 1200s is the guy you need to know. The most important scholastic thinker was Thomas Aquinas. In his work Summa Theologica, Aquinas is going to claim that reason was God's gift that could provide answers to basic philosophical questions. Reason, he said, existed in harmony with faith, both pointing to God and the orderliness of creation. All right, and the Catholic Church is later going to accept and promote Aquinas' way of thinking. All right, and really a change of attitude about classical pieces in connection with Christianity and their usefulness to the religion. Right, and finally, let's talk about medieval art and literature, and then we'll be done for the day. So the spread of universities and the revival of intellectual endeavor is going to stimulate advances in literature and the arts. This is kind of common sense. You think about it, right? This revival of learning, this new thrust for combining old ideas with new ideas is going to lead to these various advances in literature and the arts. All right, so let's talk about epics and romances. So one of the earliest surviving literary works of the feudal world was the Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf. Right, so handed down by oral tradition for 2 centuries, it was finally written down in Old English by an unknown poet in about AD 700. And of course, colorful verses and exciting narrative, the epic describes how the Anglo-Saxon warrior Beowulf defeats a horrible monster named Grendel. Romances were also coming about during this time period, right, about knights and ladies. In southern France in the AD 1100s and AD 1200s, you also have traveling poet musicians called troubadours that are going to compose lyric poems and songs about love and the feats of knights. And of course, you're going to have talented writers during this time period too. They're going to write great literary works. Particularly during this time period, a lot of women, very, very popular writers. So let's talk about vernacular literature and the medieval art, and that'll be it. So late medieval literature was increasingly written in the vernacular. Okay, and what I mean by that is in the language of everyday speech. So instead of a work being written in Latin, it might be written in, for instance, English or French or German or Italian or Spanish. It would be written kind of in the languages of the common everyday people of that area. Of course, these languages, right, are going to give each kingdom a very separate identity, right? Because if you live in the French territories, you're going to be reading works that are in French, and it's going to be this very specific identity to this piece of work. And of course, the use of vernacular languages in writing is going to make literature more accessible to more people. So major literary works in the vernacular appeared during the AD 1300s. For instance, Dante is going to write the Divine Comedy, which is an epic poem in Italian that describes an imaginary journey from heaven to hell. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer is going to produce the Canterbury Tales, probably something you may have heard of before. These narrative poems describe a varied group of pilgrims who tell stories to amuse one another on their way to Thomas A. Becket's shrine at Canterbury. All right, so these new forms of the use of literature really going to be important. So medieval art, let's talk about this really quick, and this is going to be really kind of an architectural thing, and then we'll be done. So early medieval churches, right, were built in a style called Romanesque, which combined features of Roman and Byzantine structures. So Romanesque churches had very thick walls, columns set close together, heavy curved arches, and small windows. But about AD 1150, French architects are going to be able start to begin to build in a new style called Gothic. And it's going to be a new form of architecture. And what they're going to do is they're going to replace the old Romanesque heavy, thick walls and low arches with flying buttresses. So these stone beams extending out from the walls are going to take the weight off the building off the walls. All right, this is going to allow the walls to be much thinner. All right, so it's going to allow spaces like, for instance, for stained glass windows. The ceiling and sides are supported by pointed arches made of narrow stone ribs reaching out from the tall pillars. These supports are going to allow architects to build higher ceilings and more open interiors in buildings. Medieval painters are going to turn their attention to a much smaller art form, the illuminated manuscript that we've already talked about some, right? And of course, adorned with brilliantly colored illustrations and often highlighted with gold leaf. These works were miniature masterpieces whose beauty has endured to present day. So if you want to get a good idea of what a Gothic cathedral or a Gothic style would look like, there is a picture of the Gothic cathedral at Reims, France, on page 328 that you can view. All right, so just give you a little bit better picture of that style of architecture. So in this section, what we've seen, right, is this really is economic and cultural revival. Economic expansion with the expansion of trade and new towns, new services such as banking. We talked about guilds, right, and the rise of the middle class, very, very important. And this more important idea, especially in government, of more local control. We talked about education, right, the emergence of universities and new learning, new styles of learning, new ways of learning. And then we talked about medieval art and literature, right, these changes, these new forms of literature, and especially the use of vernacular literature, and then, of course, medieval art. All right, so that's going to wrap up today's discussion. Make sure you guys go out and comment on the discussion post and be looking for more assignments to come. And thanks for your time. Have a good day.